Hello everyone, this is Marc Sabatella from Outside Shore Music, and welcome to the Music Masterclass. This is my regular series where we talk about creating music. We talk about composing, arranging, improvising, all the creative acts of making music. So, what we're going to be talking about today, as is going to be the case for, the last month or so and the next couple of months, is counterpoint. And specifically, we're going to be wrapping up our discussion of counterpoint in two voices. And when I say wrapping up, I don't mean that we never talk about counterpoint in two voices anymore. I mean, we're going to start adding additional voices in so that we have additional elements in our palette. And we'll see how we can apply what we've learned about two-voice counterpoint to multiple voice counterpoint. And I want to have that thought in the back of your mind as we go through things. Am I frozen? I seem to be okay over here, but someone else let me know if you're all seeing something frozen. But it's looking right to me. Okay, so yeah, the idea of certain aspects of two-voice counterpoint being brought forward as we talk about more voices, and also realizing that there's additional things to talk about even within the realm of two-voice counterpoint. I mean, we haven't really talked about imitation yet. So imitation is going to be a huge topic we talk about, but I'm going to wait until after we've talked about multiple voices in addition to two first before we get into anything more about imitation. We've talked a little bit about imitation. We'll talk a little bit more about it today. So let me come back to that point I was making about taking what we're learning about two-voice counterpoint and seeing how to apply it to more than two voices. So we're not going to be looking at more than two voices right now, but I want to give you one really concrete example heads up. And some of you have heard me make this point before. It's about to be made again when the new set of lessons gets released next week. And that is, it's all about this consonance and dissonance relationship, what I'm going to be talking about. And really, so much about counterpoint is about really understanding that consonance and dissonance relationship. So the thing is, when you have only two voices that you're working with, we know there's a bunch of intervals that are consonant, right? Octaves are consonant, fifths are consonant, thirds are consonant, and sixths are consonant. We know that seconds and sevenths are dissonant. We know that tritones are dissonant, and we know that perfect fourths are special, right? So we're gonna fourths have aspects of consonance and dissonance. So we'll continue to treat fourths more specially, and as we introduce more voices, we'll get to see some of the respects in which fourths are considered dissonant and some of them in which they're not. In fact, I'm going to actually go a little off script here, since we're looking at a piece of music right here that uses counterpoint in some ways. I do want to, and it's obviously got more than two voices, I want to make one point about fourths. This chord right here, this is an E, and that guy on alto clef is a C, and this violin too it's this. So that is the chord at that moment. And I'm not saying that passage is particularly contrapuntal, but it's a good example of the type of texture that I'm going to be talking about here. There is a fourth between this E and that A. Yes, a fourth separated by octaves, but it's nevertheless a fourth. And it is one of those sort of dissonant intervals. And it's an interval that, yes, it doesn't mean we don't use it. It doesn't even mean we don't put it in a chord, because this, as most of you recognize, is just a second inversion triad, right? It's an A minor triad in second inversion. Well, anytime you have an A minor triad in second inversion, so the fifth is in the bass, you're going to have a fourth above the bass. That's the way it is. So one of the things that we learned about is in two-voice counterpoint, it's considered dissonant, and that doesn't mean you don't use it. It just means you treat it in the ways that the ear wants these fourths to be treated. So we treat it as if it were dissonant, by which we mean we're going to try to resolve it. And so what happens, the next chord resolves here. I'm going to ignore the first violin for a moment and just pretend it does this. And I know I'm lying, but basically it does this. It goes from an A minor chord in second inversion to an E chord in root position. Well, that is an expected thing for second inversion triads. They do that thing very often. 1, 6, 4, going to 5, right? It's a very common cadence pattern in tonal music. So as long as we use that perfect fourth and we put it into a context in which the ear is accustomed to hearing it, no problems, right? So that is the trick here. Now, if we look at what I'm actually doing, you're going to see that I'm breaking a rule. This thing is supposed to resolve by step. That fourth should have done that, like I said. It should have done this. The second violin should have gone A to G sharp and then back to A, right? Totally should have done that. But first violin already took the G sharp. And so you have to make a decision here. Is it better to resolve that A by step, or is it better to avoid doubling the leading tone? You know, the conventions about what's going to sound good could steer you in two different directions, and you have to make a choice. You have to choose between, well, either I'm going to resolve that A by step, or I'm going to not double the leading tone. And you can't have it both ways. If you resolve the A to G sharp, you're going to have a doubled leading tone, assuming I want to keep the G sharp in the melody. But I do. It's my melody. I wrote it. I want that G sharp. So often you're having to juggle multiple ideas about what's going to sound best and make the ultimate call. So the reason, well, there's lots of reasons I point this out, but one is to provide this very important context. You know, I so often talk about rules being, you know, not like rules that say do this or you go to jail. It's more about do this and it will sound like this. Don't do this and it won't sound like that, right? So there is absolutely a lack of smoothness in the voice leading. If I play from here, if I play that at full volume and try it again, there is a slight lack of smoothness that comes if you focus on the second violin. But hopefully you can not hear that as strongly. And Dave is absolutely right. Context matters. In inner voices, we're not going to notice this not ideal voice leading as much. And also because it's instrumental music, we don't have to ask ourselves, we don't have to worry too much about how easy it is to sing. Yes, we want to, singability translates to sounding good in the ear also. But, you know, leaps can be fine. And just because something is a little awkward to sing doesn't mean it's awkward to play. So if this had been you know, the fact that this is an inner voice totally allows me to get away with it. And but this is just like, in a nutshell, as good an example of I can possibly give of why it's important to know not just what the rules are, and I do the air quotes thing a lot here, but what the rules are, but why they are there. What is that rule trying to tell you? What is the thing about perfect fourths trying to tell you? What is the thing about resolving by step trying to tell you? What is the thing about doubled leading tones trying to tell you? What is the effect of doing that versus not doing it? Trying things both ways and then being able to ask yourself the question, can I hear the results of that? Like, I can totally hear, if I just play this, can you hear how nice and smooth that is compared to, right? This is so smooth, but this is much less smooth. I can totally hear that. Hopefully you can too. And that tells you why, in general, all else equal, we want the smooth voice leading. But, there's just other things that sometimes get in the way. So as I give comments on some of the other pieces that we're going to be looking at today, I want you to keep these things in mind. It's not just about the rule says to do this or not to do this, therefore you should or shouldn't do it. It's about setting you up for success so that A, we get the sounds we want to get in the two-voice counterpoint, but also thinking ahead to when we're adding more voices and start to think a little bit more about the harmonic context of what we're doing. Is the stuff that we're doing making as much sense as we want? So the thing that I've pointed out before, I've taken a big, long, circuitous path back to what I thought my original point was going to be here. But my original point was going to be this. If we allow that consonances are octaves, fifths, thirds, and sixths, major thirds and minor thirds, major and minor sixths, and those are the only consonants. The other intervals, the seconds, sevenths, tritones, fourths are, we got to be careful about those. Then what we're eventually going to discover is as soon as we have three voices in the picture, there's the only way to get all three voices to be consonant against each other, no dissonances anywhere between any pair of voices, is to build a triad, either a root position triad or a first inversion triad. Those will be the only ways of creating textures that involve three or more voices that have no dissonances. So learning to avoid the dissonances when you only have two voices means that now we have the ability to build triads. If you're using dissonances too freely, it means that when we add a third voice, we're not going to be able to build a triad because you've already created a dissonance and you're not going to get the harmonic sound that you want. Now, if that is the goal, great. But this relationship between consonance, dissonance, and harmony is one that we're going to be exploring going forward. So, and to address Sora's point, so this melody, that's a fine melody. That leap is interesting, right? Because this, right? The first melody we hear is just chromatically going up. It's building some tension. And then we want to do something with that tension. And what I chose to do was the big dramatic leap down. These are the choices we get to make when we want to do the big dramatic leaps, when we want to do these things. And when the fact that this went in half steps is kind of cool. And check out the bass line. Whoops. Right, the bass line is also just moving very nicely in steps, kind of in contrary motion, at least after the first, after this, now it's contrary motion. So, those outer voices are the ones the ear picks up on a little bit more, but the bass voice also can leap a lot more because it's going to be leaping between roots and fifths when we get to chords and so forth. So we'll see that the bass voice actually can leap quite a lot. And so can the melody, because that's where the drama comes from. So that's a lot of context here, but it's so important because I find myself repeating similar comments in people's exercises that basically come down to one thing. Here's the one thing that I'm saying over and over in my comments, and I need to just repeat it again up front here, and then finally I'll start looking at some of the music. And that thing is, dissonance isn't going to sound at its best when it's random. It's going to sound best when it's achieving a specific purpose. And for most of the purposes that people use dissonance for throughout pretty much most of music history up until, say, the early 20th century, and a lot of music since the early 20th century, dissonances are almost invariably approached and or resolved by step. And in a context in which you've got more than two voices for a specific harmonic purpose in terms of what chord you're implying. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. I'm not saying that we can only have consonants. No, the dissonances, I just want to see, are they doing the things we expect, or are they going to sound random? Because if I just randomly play some dissonance, it's just dissonance. But if I create a context in which that makes sense and resolve it, I didn't have a context in mind. Sorry for that one. But say this one. That's just dissonant, right? But if I go, suddenly it has a purpose. It creates some tension that then gets resolved when you do that, right? So, so yeah, that was a better example than my first one. So we create, and it's because we are, right? We're implying 5 to 1. And sorry, Dave, I don't know what that piece is. So feel free to put a link, but I'm not sure what that is. And also when you talk about the bass dipping down before the end, if you mean this passage here, remember this is a cello, that's as low as it's going to go. But if you mean somewhere else, yeah, I think the lowest note it goes down to is a D, but I'm not sure exactly what you mean. I'm not going to worry about it. All right, so what I'm going to do now is flip over to some of your music. And what I'm going to do is I've got, as usual, some bookmarked scores that are ones that I haven't commented on yet. And there's quite a few of them at this point. And I know I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to get to the ones that I can. And I want to start with a fifth species counterpoint exercise. There's 2 different fifth species exercises, actually 3. I want to look at yours, Dave. 3 different kind of fifth species exercises to look at in this context. And then I'm going to move on to the projects. So let's pull this over here. Right. Well, yes. Allison, I didn't mean that E was literally the lowest note. I meant the lowest note in that harmonic context. I couldn't have dropped down an octave. It would have been nice to have gone. If that had been a contrabass, I could have done that, but was the best I could do with cello, right? So that's just, see, I didn't mean there's no notes lower than E, just none that were harmonically useful in that context. All right, so I've got a bunch of exercises here, and we're going to take a look at, I think, Mark's here, because I do want to point this one out regarding the dissonance and consonance thing, because he's definitely going a little outside the bounds in terms of use of dissonance. And when I say outside the bounds, I mean outside of Renaissance convention, not necessarily going outside more modern convention. So I'm just going to play one of these examples here, and we'll listen to it. So that's pretty fast, right? But that's pretty dramatic, but it's kind of fun, right? So I look at that example there and say, yeah, this to me exemplifies what we might be looking for. Now, there's no example of fourth species of use of suspensions on this. We'll look at that in another one. But I look at this one and say, well, that's an interesting line. It's got some, it's maybe not as varied rhythmically as it could be. It's pretty quarter note focused, but that's okay. It's got those half notes placed in a couple of places. It's very rangy, right? So as a vocal line, that's incredibly rangy. But as an instrumental line, it's really nice. And it has that really dramatic leap there. It's dramatic. It's covering an octave in the space of 3 notes, but it's all outlining a triad. And it resolves that big leap up with a step down. it has this perfect fifth in it, and it doesn't have a whole lot of prominent fifths. So let's see what Dean is talking about. So Dean, I did not hear what you're talking about, and now I'm going to listen for it. So let's hear it. Where am I? Right there? You talking about this one? Ah, this one. That's the one you're talking about. So you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. All right, I'm going to come back to Dean's, and first we're going to address Dave's. So does it work if the C sharp is lowered? Well, yeah. It totally works in a different type of sound, right? It gives you the more traditional modal sound in maybe the early Renaissance or medieval sense of the modal music before they started getting in the habit of always raising their leading tones, right? So there's any number of folk songs that go back that far, or more modern songs that are trying to get that sound going, that you don't use the leading tone. Most modern music, and by modern I mean, I don't know, 1600 forward, 1500 forward even, is going to use those leading tones. But absolutely older styles of music, and in some styles of modern music that's trying to capture a particular modal feel. You will definitely see a lot of modal jazz, a lot of modal rock, progressive rock kind of pieces that go for this more modal feel. Someone, I think, did Norwegian Wood, which the Beatles song, which pretty famously uses Mixolydian mode, which also has a lowered seventh, and that's fine. It does mean that you are a little more limited harmonically, because a lot of the things that are interesting to do harmonically kind of require use of tonicizations and leading tones, but yeah, that's fine. Okay, so let's come back to Dean's thing about that. Oh, it's here. So that, Dean is absolutely right. That is, right? We have G, we're talking about these two measures here. G to F. At the faster tempo, I didn't hear it, but I totally do now, right? And this is definitely one of the times you probably want to avoid the octaves. So we have G to G going to F. So to me, the easy fix would be to actually leap all the way down to E. I don't know that I like it better. Or go down in quarter notes. But I hate to give up the one half note we had in the piece. So then it also makes me say, well, what if I put an A above that F instead? I actually like that a lot. That's my answer. I'm going to put an A there. Yeah, I feel like the A there. So if you're talking about the A in the previous bar, this is the one that I thought you were talking about. And this is similar motion, but it's not parallel, right? We're going from here to here. So we're going similar motion into those A's. The thing is that this G is just a neighbor tone. Really, harmonically, what we have is and this, to me, is not so problematic. Oblique motion, basically this going into that just happens to have a little neighbor tone in it. So this one doesn't really bother me at all. This one did when I slowed it down, and I feel like the A made it a stronger line anyhow. Because then we get to echo that. Yep. And then echoed by that other thing there. So I kind of feel like that A actually improves the line a little bit. But in any case, yes, that parallel octaves is something to pay attention to, and good job, Dean, catching that. But in general, I feel like this is capturing things really nicely. The dissonances all work the way I expect them to in terms of being, approached, resolved by step, and moving, having a purpose that is served by moving into the note that they're moving into. And I guess that is another point that I'll make about dissonance. Dissonance typically isn't so much about itself. It's about where it's going. It's about what its purpose is, and its purpose is usually about setting up the next note, the next chord. So that's something I want you to kind of keep in mind here, is that the main purpose of our dissonances is typically going to be making the next thing sound better by giving it some extra tension or something. So what we're going to do now is listen to Bob's version here. This is Bob's, right? Yeah. And this is one on the Phrygian one here. And he says he did the one with the cantus firmus lower first, but he likes the inverted version better. So we're going to check them out both. So check this out here. This is the cantus firmus is the lower voice, and he added the upper voice. And then we inverted it, because I want to talk about that. All right, so I'm going to stop it there. So I think this also is very effective. It's a nice line, but did you all hear the same thing happen? It's not the same thing. Between the second to last measure and this measure, we have F at the beginning of the measure, and then two Fs at the beginning of that measure, two E's at the beginning of the next. Depending on who you ask, that's either okay or not okay, but I don't care about okay. I care about being aware it creates a sound, and then listening and deciding, is that my best answer? You know, I liked what the A did for me, and I felt like I was able to fix the other one and make me overall happy. I don't feel like there's a similar fix. This descending line, I feel like breaking it up is not going to make me happier. I could do something like that. I could do something like that to get rid of the, not have the F at the beginning of the bar. That could totally work. Did I miss a comment about C? What's C? Who's C? Yeah, I think I missed what the comment. Oh, maybe you're talking about the modal piece. Oh, yeah, because you're still catching up, Colleen. Yeah, that's just a choice you have to make, whether you hear that downbeat to downbeat parallel octave. Yeah, it's a choice to make, and you get to make it. But that's the only thing here that seemed at all like questionable to me. This suspension here, beautifully handled. And as that article I posted last week on easy suspensions, this is what's going on, right? We're really hearing A against C, G against B. We're just offsetting it. So we're hearing two consonances in a row, moving down by step. Therefore, we can totally offset them and create that lovely suspension sound. That sound, it's one of these things where if it's the first time you're learning about suspensions and you haven't really dealt with it before in music in any other context, it feels like this really obscure, arbitrary, specific thing, kind of like the cambiata is. But let me tell you, it's not. Cambiata is obscure. I'm not saying it never happens, but it's a pretty arbitrary, obscure, weird thing. But suspensions are just incredibly, enormously important to so much music, but especially contrapuntal music, because it's the way we can get the offset between two different rhythms so that we're not always having notes playing at the same time. It's how we're going to get that sense of independence happening, is by use of offset rhythms, and therefore tension and release we're going to create through use of suspensions. And that 4/3 suspension is absolutely what you want. So the thing about invertible counterpoint here is, I have a lesson on it, and it's also called double counterpoint, as Allison reminded me earlier. The idea is that if you are careful about your perfect fifths, then anything that works in counterpoint one way will also work when you flip it upside down. Put the bottom voice on top and top voice on the bottom, because yes, your octaves are going to stay octaves. Your thirds are going to turn into sixths, and sixths are consonant. Your seconds, which were dissonant before, turn into sevenths, which are still dissonant. But if you resolve your second by step, your seventh is also resolving by step. Everything is going to work out really nicely except your fifths, because your fifths are going to turn into fourths. And now suddenly they're kind of maybe sort of dissonant. So the only thing you have to do to make your counterpoint invertible so that you can flip the parts top to bottom is make sure that if you use a fifth somewhere, which, you don't want to use too many fifths anyhow in two-voice counterpoint, that you treat it as if it were dissonant. In other words, approach it and resolve it by step, so that when it's turned upside down and now it's a fourth, it's being approached and resolved by step. So let's hear this one now. So I like it equally well both ways. It's interesting. I heard like a dissonance here that I didn't hear in the other version. I want to listen to this again. I'll tell you what I hear, and then let's compare these two measures. And what I hear is in the original version, this major seventh is dissonant, resolves by step. But in this version, that minor ninth, this is often considered the single most dissonant interval there is, more so even than the tritone, which isn't to say we don't use it, but it definitely pricks my ear more than that major seventh did. Not a problem. It's just interesting. Another interesting thing here is that 4-3 suspension, that 4-3 suspension there, it isn't as interesting flipped upside down, because now it's just a fifth going to a sixth. There's no dissonance anymore. So it's a fine sound, but it's not as fun as 2-3 suspensions are. So 2-3 suspensions are the kind that you normally use in the lower voice, and that's why I have a whole lesson on the common suspensions and kind of walking through why certain of them kind of work better than others. So yeah, this works beautifully, but it is missing the tension of the original version, but it's a fine sound on its own. So I thought that those were like really well done, nice and simple. They're not trying to do anything too terribly fancy with what's going on here. They're just putting the principles into play. And Dave, I just wanted to look at yours briefly here, because there was an interesting thing I know. So Dave's working with Twinkle Twinkle Little Star here, and he is doing something in his fifth. I'm treating it as fifth species counterpoint here, or as accompaniment to a melody. You can think of it either way. But we're going to just check this out and talk about one thing about the consonance and dissonance on it. It's interesting. I'm going to play this on the piano because otherwise it's really quiet. Sorry. So in this version here, so Dave's doing a lot of really interesting things with it rhythmically. Love the variety of the rhythms that are going on here. And you're deliberately, and you've pointed out that there's dissonances that are, not allowed. But I want to reframe this. Again, it's not about what's allowed. It's about whether that dissonance is having the effect that you want it to have, if it's creating the particular type of tension you want. and if there would have been a different way of treating that thing. So if you've never gone through and done one of these exercises where you treat dissonances in the expected ways, I absolutely recommend doing so you understand what the home sound is that the ear expects, so that when you create things that go contrary to that, you know, hey, this is contrary to that expected sound. Now, what am I going to do about it? I'm not saying don't use it. I'm saying do the thing that, you know, is going to make it effective. So right off the bat, we get this dissonance here. So yeah, in second species counterpoint, or however we're looking at this, we wouldn't be using that dissonance. But a minute ago, I just played you this, which is the same thing, right? So there's nothing wrong with that dissonance. Now, in chopsticks, this goes to here. That's sort of the expected resolution of that dissonance. And that's not happening here. It's going here. Now, there is a context in which that makes sense. And I'm going to try to play that for you now. I'm going to have to add notes to this to make that make sense. No. I have to think through this a little bit. Sorry. What I'm trying to do is make this into an appoggiatura, so that, in other words, if the 4 chord arrives along with that G, and then the G resolves to the F, that is a situation in which a second resolving to an octave is super common as an appoggiatura approaching a chord. So it's a little unusual to have approached the 4 chord in that spot of the song, because normally the 4 chord would arrive on the next measure. But if the melody had been like 2 bars later, that also would have been a very common and expected sound. So I guess that's one of the things you get to think about is it's a sound that in itself, not a problem, but what is the expected resolution of it? And what does that therefore mean? There's another place in here where I think that's like super well done. So this passage is really nice to me. Now, you're calling this an octave, a third, but that's really an octave, right? This is kind of contrary motion coming in, and that 7th sounds really nice in that context. And this 2nd here sounds really nice in this context. That 2nd is really dissonant, but it creates a certain type of sound that can be very effective. It's not resolving by step, but if you analyze what's going on harmonically, it's basically the major 7th of a chord there, and the ear fills it in that way, and it ends up working. But it's one of those things that you then think about as you learn more about the harmonic implications of this, and think about, would I have been better off getting an E into this to make the I played an E there to make it make a little more sense. This is like in my piece where I showed you how that inner voice, that 2nd violin, did something that I'm not too crazy about, but once you add the other voices, it made total sense. This is one of those things to me. I love that sound, and I think it'll be that much more effective if there was another voice in there. And there's a couple 4ths here, like this 4th, that then comes down to the 3rd, which again, in the right context, we've talked about 4/3 suspensions. Could totally be fine. And if that A had come in later, so that the 4th comes in, there would have been ways of making that work as a suspension. I'd have to think through exactly how that works, but one way or another, it would be doable. This thing that you're calling a 5th at the end is actually a 4th, and so I think it might have been better off if it was a 5th. But that 4th there is creating a sound that's not unpleasant in itself. But again, when we start adding another voice, we'll just have to ask ourselves, what harmonic context are we talking about here? What chord are we implying by that? And is that the chord we want to have prior to this one? So it's a good example of the idea that we can't evaluate dissonances out of context necessarily if we're imagining that we're ever going to add more voices to this. And this is a piece where if we just look at it in terms of the two voices, there's maybe a couple small adjustments I would make, but there's also places where I like the sound as it exists because my mind is filling in other voices. And then if I did add other voices, then if I literally added them so my mind wasn't having to do it for me, so much the better. All right, so now I'm going to move on to look at some of the actual projects. The projects, that was a project, right? The projects were pick a melody and create some harmony to it. And what I'm going to do is let's take a look at Shelley's. I want to take a look at Patrick's. And I lost, that's because it's a post. Just take another look at, we looked at Kevin's in office hours, but I thought it was really interesting and deserving of a broader audience here. So these are some of the projects. And so all of the same concepts are going to apply. The idea of fifth species counterpoint, meaning you can kind of do what you want rhythmically. You're looking for some independence, and so I'm going to play Shelley's, which I think is really, really nice, just because it's just a really good example. All of these that I'm choosing here are just really good examples of the concepts. And the idea is that they show you how, even though we first started looking at two-voice counterpoint in the context of these artificial exercises where we're writing harmony to a whole note melody that we don't know or care anything about, really. Sorry, it's deciding to be slow for me. I don't know if anyone else is having trouble with MuseScore.com right now, but I know the site has been having big time trouble. But I also know that while I'm broadcasting, my system gets a little swamped. So I'll just keep letting this go here, and I'll keep talking meanwhile. So when you only have whole note melodies, you can be looking at this going, oh, well, this isn't going to be very interesting. So that's that one. Here we go. Here's the Brahms one. So we're going to listen to this, and I just want to point out a few things about it because it's doing all the right stuff here. Let's listen. So when I look at this, in an ideal world, if you take a melody that was written to be tonal, right? It was written to fit a specific, like the major scale and to have some particular harmonic implications. If you write counterpoint against it, it's also still probably going to sound tonal, and it might not suggest the original chords, but it's probably going to suggest chords that work pretty well. And so you don't have to be thinking about chords to accidentally write chords, right? But if you are thinking about chords, you can create that sound. And there's any number of places where I can see that happening. Like so. Right, that first measure is basically an E-flat triad, and you can tell that because the melody is the fifth and the third, and the accompaniment is the root. This, I don't know exactly what that is. Is that a 5 chord? Maybe the ear fills it in that way, but it's also just good counterpoint. It's moving that voice by step. So whether or not the ear thinks of that as a 5 chord, as an actual B flat chord or not, it makes total sense. Now, I don't know what's going on harmonically in that measure, and I don't care, because again, it's good counterpoint. Parallel thirds, and then jumping down to a fifth and coming back in contrary motion to some more thirds. Now, at some point, you ask yourself, is this too many parallel thirds? Because parallel thirds are like, they're the sugar in counterpoint. No one denies that it tastes great, but we all should probably use a little less of it than we do. And so parallel thirds and parallel sixths are like that. Man, does it taste good. It's that bowl of ice cream. Yeah, I don't even like that many sweet things overall, but yeah, ice cream for sure. So one of the things that we have to think about is creating some context so that the sugar of the parallel thirds is sweetener and not this. She's doing that by doing all sorts of clever little things like jumping down to the G so that she can come back into it in contrary motion, right? We get just that little bit of contrary motion, and that helps it not just be the parallel thirds. And now we have another third, kind of going to another third, but now she's changed up the rhythm so that the rhythms don't match. We get more independence, and that helps that feel more independent. And now we get to end this phrase on this tritone, which is a dissonant interval, and yet we know what that interval wants to do. It wants to come here, right? That interval wants to come here. And she gives it to us a measure later. So this is a common technique in classical music, not so much in Baroque music, or well, in Baroque music too, but not so much in Renaissance music, I should say, of setting up a dissonance and not resolving it until later. I talk about the idea of arpeggiating to delay the resolution. So she has it here, and then she has it repeated again here, like that. So you have that tritone here, and then she repeats the tritone here and resolves that tritone and says, yeah, that resolution of that tritone counts as resolution of the earlier one. This is absolutely good and expected. So again, if you think about the species counterpoint rules just as such and think, well, gee, that was a dissonance that never got resolved, we have to look at it in that expanded context and realize that, yes, we are eventually resolving it, that these two bars work to create that 5-7 sound, B flat 7 going to E flat, so that it creates that sound. So yeah, that's one of those things where you get that additional context that helps you figure out how to take these arbitrary seeming rules and make music out of them. Then she's really got this nice thing going on now, right, where there's different like motion, where the top voice has the half note, the bottom voice moves. Top voice has the eighth notes, bottom voice stays the same. Top voice has the half note, bottom voice moves. Bottom voice has the half note, top voice moves. And that's going on because the original melody had a mix of eighth notes and half notes and quarter notes. So she chose to put her long notes in the accompaniment when the top voice was moving. So the top voice is doing that, and she just has a single note below it. Or the top voice is going, so she has motion in the bottom voice. That's what you're looking for. This idea we're going to be using a ton throughout the rest of the course. Figuring out ways to say, well, one voice is sitting still, some other voice should move to keep the momentum going forward, right? So, yeah, that's it's just a really good example of that. So I'm gonna pop over to Danny Boy here, and this I only listened to a little bit of, but I know that Patrick, you were like jumping ahead a little bit. And so I just want to point out a couple of things about how even knowing just a little bit of stuff, you can make interesting things happen. And yeah, so let's take a listen. All right. So, Patrick, I know you said you hadn't gone through all of the different species exercises and everything yet, but I would say just based on what one needs to know about first and maybe second species counterpoint, you're doing a good job with things here. And the things that I'm going to point out, I think will like hopefully make sense if you only know just the littlest bit. And yes, rhythmically, beautiful stuff going on as far as how the long note here is being supported by eighth notes there, and moving notes here being supported by a half note there. The more of that you can do, the better as far as getting a sense of independence between the voices. That also brings up another point that always bears having in the back of your head. How important is it that your voices always feel independent? Obviously, that's the definition of counterpoint, has to do with independent voices, and that's what we're studying here. But you could step back and look at counterpoint as your sugar. Maybe it's not sugar. Maybe it's, whole grains or something. It's something that you definitely want, and you want to eat a fair amount of it, but you still don't want to build your entire meal out of. I'm just going with food for some reason right now. So it's okay if you're writing a piece and portions of it are more contrapuntal and portions of it are less contrapuntal. If you think about the opening theme music that we always hear, that right, there's nothing contrapuntal about this. That is as non-contrapuntal as you get. It's four voices moving in complete homorhythmic texture. But then it goes into a contrapuntal section. And then there's another section that's a brief section of the voices coming together rhythmically, more counterpoint, and then a homorhythmic thing at the end. So being able to play with those elements is absolutely fine. So is this parallel octaves, or is that just an interesting texture? I want to say it's just an interesting texture. Right? That's my call. I like it. And then it gets to expand contrary motion and set up the harmony. In point of fact, that's a pretty common device to let the pickups to a piece have either a single instrument or just unison or octaves, and then split into harmony on the first downbeat. And that's the first time you would hear a full chord. That's a really typical device. And so those parallel octaves are beautiful to me. It makes sense. It's a texture. Like, and in the lesson that I gave on parallel octaves, I used a Beethoven example where he had some counterpoint going, and then he did something that was very specifically parallel octaves because it was just thickening them. It was just doubling the melody. So that's all good. Now here I will say there's nothing wrong with that at all, but it does feel like you're thinking harmonically, like, oh, this is a one chord and I'm going to go root 5, root 1, 5, 1. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with thinking harmonically while creating counterpoint, but sometimes it sort of jumps out a little bit as like, oh, this feels very overt. And so that would be something to think about, is how overt you want to be with that. But I liked all the little contrary motions that are happening. Oops. So like this G here, that G has no specific harmonic reason to be present, right? If you think about the usual harmonization of this, it would land on an F chord right there on the downbeat. So if you were purely thinking harmonically, you'd be putting that F chord there, and you'd be putting the F down and calling it good. I got a sixth against it. I got a fifth against it. I got a third against it. All good. So if you're purely thinking harmonically, you might not have put in that G. The fact that he put the G in there is, like, to my ears, effective, because it makes it not be too purely harmonic. Now, you can then ask yourself, is this fourth moving then by leap as good of a sound as we would want? Well, at least it's only an eighth note, but we do get parallel. Now, we don't really get parallel fifths or anything. I just don't like fifths that much at all, but it was the best choice, I think, for a note there. Now, you could have experimented with other notes there, but anyhow, this type of thinking that says, I'm going to put this note in there because I like what it's doing contrapuntally, independent of what it's doing harmonically, yeah, we want some of that going. And then the motion here. This is a fourth here also that I feel like I like the motion here, the independence of the motion, because this voice goes down. But then this fourth here, you could ask yourself, well, is that the best choice? Because, again, I kind of want it to resolve by step, and it kind of does, but is it the best resolution? I don't know. You want to figure out what is the harmonic context that you're trying to create here if you're going to use a fourth and resolve it. One voice is moving by step. Got to hand that to you. So, but it's the melody that's moving by step, and your counterpoint isn't. And so, if it just did that, that's often a fix. To just do that, and often it can make things more rhythmically interesting, just adding those passing tones. Yeah, so that's something to think about. Then there was one passage where there was a parallel octave thing that maybe was less deliberate. That's very triadic, right? So now at this point, we're clearly thinking harmonically. And when the melody is outlining a triad, there's maybe not a better version. That's the thing I want to talk about, not parallel octaves. That tritone resolving in contrary motion. Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Tritone resolving in contrary motion. So yes, in first species counterpoint is, as we learn the Renaissance rules and everything in those slow-moving whole note examples, we wouldn't use a tritone or any other dissonance in one-to-one counterpoint. But as I've constantly mentioned, in faster-moving passages, those dissonances are going to be fine and expected. So that's beautiful. The next thing is the parallel octaves, and I feel like that probably, there's probably a better solution now. Like that E there could have gone down to a C, or that D here could have gone up to an F. I don't know. You figure out what else you want to do. But yeah, that tritone resolving there, that perfect use of a tritone, perfect resolution, love it. So finally, I mentioned Kevin's piece, and it's just really, really nice, and it's a great one for me to kind of leave on because it's going to bridge the discussion into next week when we do talk about more voices and harmony that much more. I mean, obviously, I've talked about harmony some already, but let's hear Kevin's When the Saints Go Marching In. So, bravo. I mean, this is just so well done on so many levels, right? I mean, we've got all those totally independent rhythms going on. There's like hardly any just tiny little passages of like one against one counterpoint of parallel thirds and so forth. It's just the tiniest bit of sugar as far as that goes. Mostly they're completely independent rhythmically, eighth notes against quarter notes. And yeah, sometimes when the long note is in one voice, then the moving part's in the other voice. And then when the moving parts, he's got places where I don't know that he does have places. Yeah, here's a place where there's a moving note, a moving part in the upper voice, and he puts just a half note against it. So there's that wonderful balance of the rhythm. There's, great handling of you can go through the whole thing and look at how he's treating his dissonances, and it's all pretty well by the book stuff as far as how he's treating all his dissonances, approaching, resolving by step. The most noteworthy thing that I want to leave you with here is that G sharp. Because this piece is in C, we don't need G sharp. But he was saying, well, I felt it. I wasn't thinking harmonically. I just felt its use. And this is where harmony came from. We're approaching what's basically a cadence in A minor. So this basically gives us the leading tone into that A minor cadence. It's these interior cadences, the composers and sometimes just the singers on their own or instrumentalists on their own, hearing an opportunity to create cadences by adding leading tones. This is where a lot of what eventually becomes harmony comes from, the idea of secondary dominance. So that sound right there, it's a chromatic passing tone is all it is, but it's a significant chromatic passing tone because it creates the sense of E7 going to A minor. It creates an interior cadence, this temporary tonicization, whatever we want to call it. Keep that in your mind as we go forward, because that is the kind of stuff we're going to start exploiting a lot more as we start talking more about multiple voices, more than two voices, and what implications that can have for harmony. So, yeah, a lot of music that we got to talk about. That's not where I want to be. I want to be over here, and I bet it's going to not play very... There we go. So, yeah, there's a lot of other pieces that people have submitted, and I'm going to be putting in some comments on those. By all means, I encourage everyone who's been working through this course, try your hand at that project. Do a little bit of each species counterpoint to work up to it, and feel free to post those too. But mostly, I really want to see people try their hands at the projects, trying to keep these principles in mind, trying to think about your use of dissonance, make it purposeful, treat it well in terms of the approach and the resolution, and it will do great things for you, I promise. So I'm really looking forward to now next week getting into the next section of the course. So I will see you then. Okay, bye all.